When I was in my late 20s, I was in a kind of a state of restlessness, trying to figure out my life. I still hadn't sort of landed, if you will, on a vector, a path, in the sort of the larger picture of my life, and was kind of in a movement of reversion, if you will, a conversion, sort of deepening my faith and realizing that this relationship with God needed to take more and more become the center of my life. And I was going on different retreats, and often these retreats had, were set out in the midst of some kind of a natural, peaceful setting. As I said many years ago earlier, that I used to love to go on these long bike trips outside, camping and so on. So I found a great peace in nature, and I found a certain closeness to God in that setting. And so during my kind of teaching life, I was a teacher, I would still seek that on a kind of a smaller level, just going off for a walk in the conservation area and just trying to find quiet and to listen. And sometimes I would just go off and sit on a log somewhere in the woods and just be, and that's what we're called to do. I've kind of found through my readings and, again, going on retreats that there was this real necessity just to be still and to listen. And so that's what I was trying to do. I would do that on a regular basis. And I remember once doing that and just sitting on this log and just trying to be peaceful, quiet, just being there. And then coming out of that, going back on the trail and meeting this young man in this conservation area who had become lost. He had somehow he had been separated from the people he was with, and he just couldn't figure out how to get back to the parking lot. Not in an incredibly, dangerous place or anything, but he was just a bit concerned and frustrated. And as I approached him, I just smiled and asked him, how he was, and he explained his situation. And because I was familiar with that place, I was able to guide him back to where he needed to go. Just a simple moment, a simple encounter. That's where I found my mind going back, That's probably, 30 years or so ago. As I was preparing today for this reflection, for this homily, during this second week of Advent, when we are, again, journeying with this book, Holy Moments, and trying to just reflect on a deeper level what this means to enter into holy moments of our life. And Father Janelle spoke last week on that first part of what Matthew Kelly calls a holy moment, that necessity of simply being open. And he referred to Mary having that openness, and Matthew Kelly says that's the first part of it, just making yourself open to God, So the second part, in the second week of Advent, we're looking at that second part of that definition, making yourself available to God. Availability, what's that all about? How does that impact our spiritual life? How does that make us, more open and disposed to placing God at the center of our life so that he is leading us more and more. And we're seeking to follow his will and in those moment-by-moment circumstances of our life where we prayerfully do what God is calling us to do. So there's that necessity of availability. And I'm just going to read what Matthew Kelly says. This is the second chapter we're into now. And he's sort of breaking down this definition. And he says, to make yourself available to God is simply this. He says, if you want to see miracles, make yourself available to God. When we make ourselves available to God, amazing things happen. Throughout history, God has collaborated with the most unlikely people to make amazing things happen. And now he wants to collaborate with you. God almost never chooses the most qualified person or the people in positions of power and authority. God chooses people nobody would expect. When God is looking for someone to collaborate with, he chooses those who make themselves available to him. He does not see your past as an impediment to your future. The rest of your life begins the moment you make yourself available to God. So that's what availability then is all about. It's just living in the present, being in that present moment. As he says, the past is gone. Nothing we can do about that. The future, who knows what's around the corner. We only have the present moment. And that's where God wants to meet us. That's where God wants to act in us and call us into that next action, that next instance of collaborating with him. And it can happen in big moments, it can happen in little moments. It can happen at any age and every age of our life. As he says very clearly, you know, it's not a question of only being chosen because we're somebody or something in the world. That doesn't matter. We are, by the very fact that we're human and we have a faith, then we can make ourselves available to God. As we now journey a little further into this Advent season, again, we said we were looking at these characters, these people that make up the Advent story. And so last week, again, Father Janelle referred to Mary and her story, her openness to God. Today, we'll just look briefly at Joseph and how he made himself available to God. And so we know that story of Joseph, how he was betrothed to Mary. And he had his life all planned out. You know, as a carpenter, he had gained that skill, that trade. He was immersed in that work. He was engaged to Mary, this young woman from the city of Nazareth, town of Nazareth. You know, I'm sure they had plans for a family, for a whole domestic life, for life in that village with their extended family and friends. And then he gets this news that Mary's with child, and it has nothing to do with him. And so this would have been incredibly disorienting and confusing, discombobulating for Joseph, to say the least. To say the least. And yet in that circumstance, he was still able to make himself available to God. And it's interesting how God chose that moment of his availability. Do you remember how God spoke to him? He was sleeping. He was sleeping. He was prostrate on his bed. And that was a time where God chose to communicate to him and to let him know that what had happened to Mary was completely of God. Completely of God. And Joseph, in that moment, you know, of availability, of freedom, decided to collaborate with God. As crazy and as unbelievable as it all seemed, he chose to collaborate with God by simply making himself available. And you know, if we read that part of Matthew's gospel, it just says Jesus got up, and instead of dismissing Mary quietly as he had originally planned to do, he took her as his wife. That changed, if you will, the whole course of salvation history in that one little ordinary, tiny moment. You know, he took Mary as his wife. He became the father of Jesus. Joseph had no idea what was in the future. He just simply made himself available to God in that particular moment. And so when we took that minute just before Mass, you know, we asked ourselves, you know, when have I made myself available to God? You know, we have all done it. We have all done it. And God wants us to continue to do it. And it's good for us, perhaps, to take this week, in the second week of Advent, to just continue that reflection. When have I made myself available to God? We've all done it, in big circumstances and little circumstances, if we start to reflect on it. And God will let you know those moments to sort of be that rock from which you can then take the next step forward, to continue to collaborate yourself and make yourself available to God. You know, just last week, I wanted to be here to be part of the launch of our Advent season, to be present to the Advent retreat that Father Joshua gave us on Saturday morning, to be with Father Janelle as he began preaching on the first Sunday of Advent. But I couldn't be. Well, I chose not to be, not because I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be here, but I was called somewhere else. I was called to Pittsburgh. My brother-in-law lives in Pittsburgh with his wife, my sister Joanna. And it was that last weekend that he became Catholic. He had been married to my sister for 36 years and was sort of Christian nominally, but not in any way practicing. But over 36 years of marriage, of loving his wife, of seeing her live her life as faithfully as possible, started to make himself available to God. Even, I think, unbeknownst to himself, over the last 36 years in different instances. And he shared with me some of those instances last weekend. Some of them very beautiful, some of them very personal. But one of his biggest stumbling blocks, I think, was that he's a very intelligent and academic man. He's a scientist. And so in some ways, his intellect had sort of made it difficult for him to take those steps of faith and make himself available to God. But through different instances, taking an alpha was one of them 3 years ago, joining my sister as she would lead and facilitate these evangelizing programs in her parish, it started to rub off on him to the point where he realized he needed to do something about it and take that next step. And the next step was simply talking to his parish priest. And he did that even unbeknownst to my sister. Right? That led to a whole series of meetings and formation where he was able to join the Catholic Church just last Sunday. That was an amazing holy moment, an amazing holy moment. My sister said it was a miracle. It is, you know. Miracles happen all over, everywhere, if we just have those eyes of faith to see it. So today, as we enter the second week of Advent, as we hear those readings about preparation, about making ourselves available, you know, it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. And as Peter says in that second reading, you know, we just simply have to continue to wait for for the coming of the day of the Lord.